Good day. Today is April 13th. I'm Elizabeth Ritchie from Ramban and Ritchie Immigration Attorneys. As you can see behind me, I have Thomas Jefferson's statue from the Jefferson Memorial. Today is his birthday, so I would like to mention that originally Thomas Jefferson was opposed to immigration, but in his first report to Congress, he asked some questions that are relevant today. He also called for a loosening of a policy which only allowed immigrants to become citizens after 14 years. I'll talk a little bit about more about that in a moment. And he asked, shall we refuse the unhappy fugitives from distress that hospitality which the savages of the wilderness extended to our fathers arriving in this land? Shall oppressed humanity find no asylum on this globe? So happy birthday to Thomas Jefferson. And this leads me into my next comment, which is about citizenship. Got this question on Friday, someone who's abroad and asked about becoming a citizen or a permanent resident now. And I'd like to mention that there's two rules that affect citizenship. One is that you have to have been a permanent resident for the requisite period, and what Jefferson was talking about before was the 14-year period. Now, generally speaking, it's either 3 or 5 years of residency before you can become a U.S. citizen. So 3 years is if you got your residency through your citizen spouse, through the permanent resident spouse, and you're still married and living with that spouse, that petitioning spouse. If that applies, then you only need to have been a permanent resident for 3 years before filing for citizenship. And you can actually do so 90 days before your third residency anniversary. So 3 years for those who receive their residency through their spouse, and everyone else is 5 years. So maybe you did receive your residency through a spouse, but you're no longer married or living together, or you received your residency through asylum, for example, or through employment. Then you need to wait 5 years. So 5 years before your fifth residency anniversary, or 90 days before that fifth anniversary before you can file. It's called the Form N-400. So that's how long you have to have been a permanent resident as versus physical presence. So let's say you're filing for your citizenship after having been a resident for 5 years. Then the previous 5 years, you go back and you calculate, have you been physically in the US for half of that time? So 2.5 of 5, or it's 1.5 of 3. So there's a physical presence requirement as well. So those people who travel considerably, there's multinational executives, for example, they need to not only have been a permanent resident for the requisite time, but also make sure that they met the physical presence requirement. And this virus is going to have an effect on so many permanent residents who cannot come back to the US to meet that requirement. So we'll see how that plays out in the future. There are, again, two rules: how long you had to have been a permanent resident and how long you had to have been physically present. So you may have been a permanent resident for 20 years, for example, but over the last 5 or 3 year period, you have to calculate, were you physically in the US for enough time? And that's half of the required period. Next, I want to clarify something about our essay contest that I mentioned last week. We are sponsoring a middle school essay contest called Celebrate America. And what wasn't clear was that the contest is for all middle schoolers in the US. You don't have to be in Leon County or Florida for that matter. All middle schoolers are welcomed to participate in our contests. And there's a video and some rules up from last week you can see on our Facebook page. The next is an announcement, and it's regarding the Vermont Service Center. A USCIS worker there contracted the coronavirus, so the Vermont Service Center is temporarily closed. We'll see how that will affect so many of the petitions that Vermont processes, especially for workers in Florida. But USCIS is still open. They're just not seeing the public, meaning they're not doing biometrics interviews, just biometrics or interviews, or for naturalization or for adjustment. They haven't done info passes for quite a long time, but for now, Vermont is closed and USCIS otherwise is open. So those are my announcements for today and my congratulations celebrating Thomas Jefferson's birthday. Please email me at elizabeth@rambana.com. Comment or post about things you'd like me to talk about in the future. This is an exciting time. I'd be happy to answer your questions. Perhaps you have a suggestion for a virtual background. I'd love to hear from you. We'll see you next time. Thank you.